She said friendship was too precious to risk, so I respected her decision and quietly started planning my exit from Seattle. After 2 years of Thursday evening game nights at Brooke's apartment, I finally worked up the courage to tell her how I felt, only to watch our carefully built world crumble with her gentle rejection. I'd been circling this moment for months, watching her animated discussions about podcast production clients while we played our favorite cooperative strategy games, studying the way she'd light up when explaining complex audio editing techniques or describing her latest craft beer brewing experiments with the kind of passion that made everything she touched seem important. That Thursday started like any other, with me bringing over the new expansion for Pandemic Legacy while she had her home brewing setup bubbling away in the corner, filling her apartment with the rich smell of hops and barley that had become as familiar as my own morning coffee. We'd fallen into this comfortable rhythm over the past year, meeting weekly to tackle increasingly challenging board games while she told me about difficult clients who didn't understand the creative process, and I shared stories about security vulnerabilities I'd discovered at work during my penetration testing assignments. I was a cybersecurity analyst for a mid-sized tech company, spending my days hunting for weaknesses in corporate networks and firewall configurations, but those Thursday evenings felt like the highlight of my week in ways that my professional achievements never could. Brooke had this way of making everything feel important, whether she was explaining the intricacies of podcast editing software or strategizing our next move against a particularly brutal game scenario that required perfect coordination between multiple player roles. During a particularly intense moment in our game, with artificial diseases threatening to overwhelm our virtual world, I found myself watching her concentrate on the board with that focused expression she got when solving complex problems, and I realized I couldn't keep pretending these feelings didn't exist any longer. I told her I'd been thinking about us differently lately, that somewhere between our debates about proper hop timing and late-night gaming sessions that stretched past midnight, I'd started seeing her as more than just a friend and gaming partner. The words came out awkward and rushed, nothing like the smooth confession I'd rehearsed in my head during countless commutes to work while sitting in Seattle traffic. She set down her cards carefully and gave me that look I'd seen her use with difficult clients, kind but firm and utterly professional, before explaining that she valued our friendship too much to risk changing the dynamic we'd built. She'd watched too many close friendships destroyed when people tried to shift from platonic to romantic, and she couldn't bear the thought of losing what we'd built together over these 2 years of shared interests and mutual support. I sat there nodding, trying to look understanding while feeling like someone had just told me our favorite game was being permanently retired from production due to manufacturing defects. The rest of the evening felt strained and artificial, both of us trying to pretend nothing fundamental had changed while the unfinished game sat between us like evidence of my miscalculation and poor timing. Walking back to my apartment that night through Seattle's persistent drizzle, I realized I'd been fooling myself about the sustainability of our friendship, and the painful truth was that I needed to protect myself from the slow torture of loving someone who'd never see me that way. The next morning, staring at my laptop screen filled with security protocols and vulnerability reports, I found myself thinking about more than just network defenses and started researching cybersecurity positions in other cities, telling myself it was just career exploration while knowing deep down that I was already planning my escape from this emotional minefield. Every notification from our group chat about weekend brewery tours or board game meetups felt like another reminder of what I'd lost, and I knew that staying in Seattle would mean watching Brooke move on with her life while I remained stuck in this painful limbo of unrequited feelings and false hope. The strategic withdrawal began subtly, with carefully crafted excuses that sounded perfectly legitimate to anyone who didn't know my real motivations for avoiding our usual social activities and group gatherings. When Brooke texted about our usual Thursday game night the following week, I replied that I had to work late on a critical security audit for one of our major clients, which was technically true even if the timing wasn't entirely coincidental. The weekend brewery tour she'd organized with our friend group got the same treatment, with me claiming I needed to study for my advanced ethical hacker certification exam, another truthful statement that served my purposes perfectly. I'd been putting off pursuing additional cybersecurity certifications for months, but suddenly they became my excuse for everything while also genuinely advancing my qualifications for the job search I'd already begun in earnest. Each declined invitation felt like another small cut, but I knew that maintaining our normal routine would only prolong my suffering and make the eventual departure more painful for both of us. Within 3 weeks of my confession, I'd submitted applications to cybersecurity firms in Nashville, Denver, Austin, and Charlotte, focusing on positions that would represent significant career advancement while getting me far enough away from Seattle to start fresh without feeling like I was running away completely. The Nashville opportunity caught my attention immediately because Secure Vault Financial specialized in cryptocurrency security protocols, an emerging field that would challenge me in ways my current position never could. They were looking for a senior analyst to lead their blockchain vulnerability assessments and cryptocurrency fraud investigations, and the salary was nearly 40% higher than what I was making in Seattle with better benefits and stock options. I spent 2 weeks preparing for their virtual interviews, diving deep into cryptocurrency fraud patterns and distributed ledger security frameworks, channeling my emotional energy into professional development instead of dwelling on my personal disappointment and rejection. When Secure Vault offered me the position after a rigorous 3-round interview process that included technical demonstrations and case study presentations, I accepted immediately, giving my current company the standard 2 weeks notice while telling myself this was purely a career decision that had nothing to do with running away from unrequited love. The hardest part was organizing the farewell dinner with our friend group, knowing that Brooke would be there and that she'd probably figured out the real reason behind my sudden career change and geographic relocation. We met at our favorite tap house, the same place where we'd celebrated her successful podcast launch and my promotion to senior analyst, and I could feel her watching me throughout the evening as I talked enthusiastically about Nashville's music scene and the technical challenges of cryptocurrency security with forced enthusiasm that probably fooled everyone except her. When she cornered me near the bar during a quiet moment and asked directly if this move had anything to do with our conversation, I maintained that I'd been considering this opportunity for months, which was partially true since I'd always been interested in financial cybersecurity, even if the timeline was accelerated by my need to escape this emotional situation. Her expression told me she wasn't entirely convinced, but she didn't push further, perhaps understanding that some questions are better left unasked when the answers might be too painful for everyone involved, and I could see in her eyes that she knew exactly what was happening even if neither of us wanted to acknowledge it directly. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of well-meaning congratulations and promises to keep in touch that we both knew would fade quickly once I was established in my new life, and I found myself already mentally preparing for the emotional distance I'd need to maintain to make this transition successful while wondering if she understood that sometimes protecting yourself requires disappointing the people you care about most, even when it breaks your heart to do so. Nashville became my laboratory for reinvention, a place where I could build a completely different version of myself without the constant reminders of what I'd lost back in Seattle. I threw myself into transforming every aspect of my life with the same methodical approach I used for penetration testing, systematically identifying weaknesses in my old routine and implementing comprehensive security measures against emotional vulnerability. The cycling clubs were my first experiment in becoming someone new, joining weekend rides through the rolling hills surrounding the city where I discovered that physical exhaustion was an excellent distraction from mental anguish. Within a month, I'd upgraded from my old hybrid bike to a serious road bike and was logging 50-mile rides every Saturday, pushing myself until my legs burned and my lungs screamed, finding a strange satisfaction in choosing my own suffering instead of having it chosen for me. The woodworking classes at the community center became my meditation, working with my hands to create something tangible while my mind processed the aftermath of my Seattle life. There's something deeply satisfying about taking raw lumber and transforming it into furniture, measuring twice and cutting once, following plans that actually make sense unlike the chaotic mess of human emotions. My instructor was this retired carpenter named Frank who had zero tolerance for sloppy work and infinite patience for teaching proper technique, and under his guidance I built a coffee table that was actually level and didn't wobble when you set a cup down. Nashville's music scene offered another avenue for exploration, something I'd never had access to in Seattle's tech-dominated culture, so I started taking guitar lessons at the same community center where I was learning woodworking. My fingers were clumsy at first, struggling with chord transitions that seemed impossible until suddenly they weren't, and I found myself practicing scales while vulnerability assessments ran on my work laptop. The music became a soundtrack to my new life, late evenings spent picking out simple melodies while reports compiled in the background. My new position at Secure Vault Financial challenged me in ways I hadn't experienced since my early career days, diving deep into cryptocurrency exchange vulnerabilities and blockchain security protocols that required constant learning and adaptation. The work involved traveling across the Southeast to assess financial institutions' digital security postures, which meant I was frequently in Atlanta, Miami, or Charlotte conducting penetration tests and vulnerability assessments that kept my mind focused on technical problems instead of personal ones. When Brooke's first text arrived 2 weeks into my Nashville adventure, asking how I was settling in and whether I'd found any good board game shops yet, I found myself staring at the message for several minutes before responding with a brief update about work and the weather that completely ignored her gaming reference. She tried to engage me in our old conversational style, sharing details about a difficult podcast client and asking for my advice on handling creative disputes, but I kept my responses surface level and professional, like I was talking to a former colleague rather than someone who'd once been my closest friend. The shift became most apparent when she called me late one night after someone had vandalized her apartment building, breaking windows and spray painting the entrance, leaving her shaken and needing someone to talk through her anxiety and fear about living alone. The old me would have stayed on the phone for hours, offering comfort and practical advice, maybe even looking into flights back to Seattle to help her deal with the aftermath and apartment hunting, but the new me sent a brief text suggesting she contact the police and stay with friends for the night. I could almost feel her confusion through the phone screen as she processed my emotional unavailability. This person who'd once dropped everything to help her troubleshoot audio equipment problems now treating her crisis like a minor inconvenience that required minimal involvement from my end, and I knew she was finally beginning to understand that the Austin who used to be her emotional support system had been left behind in Seattle along with our Thursday night gaming tradition. 4 months into my Nashville reinvention, I discovered the makerspace that would become my second home and introduced me to someone who would fundamentally change how I understood human connection. The Nashville Makers Collective occupied a converted warehouse in the Gulch district, filled with 3D printers, laser cutters, welding stations, and enough power tools to make any engineer feel at home. I'd initially joined to access their advanced woodworking equipment for more complex projects than what the community center could handle, but the collaborative atmosphere drew me in deeper than I'd expected. It was there, hunched over a problematic dovetail joint on a bookshelf I was building, that I first noticed Camila Rodriguez arguing with a CNC machine that refused to cooperate with her design specifications. She was this petite woman with paint-splattered work clothes and an intensity that reminded me of debugging particularly stubborn code, except she was designing prosthetic devices that would actually change people's lives instead of just securing their digital assets. Our first conversation happened when I offered to help troubleshoot her machine calibration issues, applying the same systematic diagnostic approach I used for network security to her mechanical engineering problem. Within 20 minutes, we'd identified a software configuration error that had been plaguing her project for weeks, and she looked at me with genuine appreciation that had nothing to do with romantic interest and everything to do with professional respect. That's when I realized how different this felt from my dynamic with Brooke, where I'd always been the emotional support provider rather than an intellectual equal. Camila approached problems with the same analytical mindset I brought to cybersecurity, breaking down complex challenges into manageable components and testing solutions methodically until something worked. Our conversations flowed naturally between technical subjects and personal interests, with her sharing stories about developing adaptive prosthetics for children while I explained the intricate vulnerabilities that made cryptocurrency exchanges such attractive targets for sophisticated hackers. She understood the satisfaction I got from preventing digital theft the same way I appreciated her work giving mobility back to amputees, both of us finding purpose in solving problems that mattered beyond ourselves. Our weekend woodworking projects became collaborative efforts, with her engineering background complementing my growing carpentry skills as we tackled increasingly ambitious furniture builds. When I mentioned my goal of building a custom gaming table with built-in storage and LED lighting systems, she immediately offered to help design the mechanical components and electrical systems, approaching my hobby project with the same serious attention she gave her medical device prototypes. The difference between working with Camilla and my old friendship with Brooke was striking in ways that took me weeks to fully process and understand. With Brooke, I'd always felt like I was performing emotional labor, listening to her problems and offering solutions while rarely receiving the same level of engagement about my own interests and challenges. Camilla brought reciprocity to every interaction, asking thoughtful questions about my cryptocurrency security work and sharing insights from her biomedical engineering perspective that actually enhanced my understanding of complex systems vulnerabilities. Our Friday evening sessions at the Makerspace stretched into dinner at nearby restaurants, where we'd continue discussing everything from machine learning applications in prosthetics to the psychological aspects of social engineering attacks, conversations that left me intellectually stimulated rather than emotionally drained. She had this way of challenging my assumptions about security protocols by applying medical device safety standards, pointing out parallels between protecting patient data and securing financial transactions that I'd never considered before. When she explained how her prosthetic designs had to account for both mechanical failure modes and cybersecurity threats in connected devices, I found myself looking at my own work through an entirely different lens, realizing that the stakes in both our fields were ultimately about protecting vulnerable people from systems that could cause genuine harm. My career flourished in ways I'd never imagined possible back in Seattle, starting with leading a high-profile investigation into cryptocurrency exchange vulnerabilities that would ultimately prevent millions in potential fraud losses. The case began when SecureVault's monitoring systems detected unusual trading patterns across several major exchanges, suggesting coordinated attacks targeting wallet security protocols that could have compromised thousands of individual accounts. I spent 6 weeks developing penetration testing frameworks specifically designed for blockchain environments, working 18-hour days to trace the attack vectors before the perpetrators could execute their final phase. When we successfully identified and patched the vulnerabilities, preventing what could have been one of the largest cryptocurrency heists in history, the industry took notice in ways that felt surreal after years of relative anonymity in corporate cybersecurity. The recognition came in the form of speaking opportunities at major conferences in Atlanta, Miami, and eventually a keynote presentation at the Southeast Cybersecurity Summit, where I found myself explaining complex blockchain security concepts to audiences of financial executives and security professionals who actually cared about the technical details. Meanwhile, according to our mutual friends back in Seattle, Brooke's podcast production business was struggling with increasingly difficult clients and inconsistent income streams that left her scrambling to maintain her freelance lifestyle. Jordan, our mutual friend who'd stayed in touch despite my geographic distance, mentioned during one of our occasional video calls that Brooke had been asking about my happiness and relationship status with what seemed like concerning frequency. She'd apparently been monitoring my LinkedIn posts about professional achievements and conference presentations, viewing every story I shared about Nashville's music scene and commenting on my social media with a level of engagement that suggested she was tracking my success more closely than casual friendship would warrant. The contrast became particularly stark when I posted about presenting at the major cybersecurity summit in Austin while Brooke simultaneously posted frustrated complaints about losing another podcast client to budget cuts and creative differences. Jordan mentioned that she'd been bringing me up in conversations with increasing regularity, asking whether I seemed happy in Nashville and whether I'd mentioned dating anyone new, questions that felt inappropriate given our history and her role in ending our friendship. The irony wasn't lost on me that while I was building a reputation in cybersecurity circles and developing meaningful relationships with colleagues and friends like Camilla, Brooke appeared to be struggling both professionally and personally in the life she'd chosen over maintaining our connection. When cybersecurity journals started featuring articles about our fraud prevention work, including a detailed case study in Information Security Today that mentioned my role in developing the detection protocols, I found myself thinking less about vindication and more about how different my life had become from those Thursday nights playing board games and discussing her latest client drama. The recognition felt earned rather than lucky, built on genuine expertise and collaborative relationships with colleagues who respected my technical skills rather than just tolerating my emotional investment in their problems, and I realized that success felt completely different when it came from people who actually valued what I brought to the table instead of simply accepting my support as an expected service. Each professional milestone seemed to highlight the growing distance between my new life and the person I'd been in Seattle, someone who'd measured his worth by how effectively he could solve other people's problems rather than building something meaningful of his own. The transformation felt complete when I received an invitation to speak at the International Cybersecurity Conference in Las Vegas, sharing the stage with industry leaders whose names I'd only read in security journals, presenting research that had grown directly from the cryptocurrency fraud prevention case that launched my reputation beyond the Southeast region. 2 years after my escape from Seattle, Brooke orchestrated what she probably thought was a casual coincidence but felt more like a calculated ambush when she appeared outside my office building in downtown Nashville. I was leaving SecureVault's headquarters after a particularly productive day finalizing security protocols for a new cryptocurrency exchange client when I spotted her standing near the lobby entrance, looking nervous and out of place in her carefully chosen outfit that screamed tourist trying too hard to blend in. She claimed she was in town meeting potential podcast clients and just happened to be in the neighborhood, but Nashville isn't exactly a hotbed of podcast production work, and the timing felt suspiciously aligned with the LinkedIn post I'd shared about our latest security milestone just days earlier. The lunch she suggested turned into an awkward hour at a downtown restaurant where I deliberately chose a table in the busy main dining area rather than somewhere private, keeping our conversation professional while frequently mentioning Camilla and our shared woodworking projects to make it abundantly clear that I'd moved on completely. I watched her process each reference to my new life with barely concealed frustration, particularly when I described the custom gaming table Camilla and I had built together, complete with integrated LED lighting and hidden storage compartments that would have impressed even our old Thursday night group. Her attempts to steer the conversation toward our shared memories fell flat against my determinately forward-looking responses, and I could see her realizing that the Austin who used to get nostalgic about board games and brewing experiments had been replaced by someone focused on building a future rather than revisiting the past. The desperation in her subsequent messages became increasingly transparent over the following weeks, starting with innocent texts about random memories that escalated to fabricated family emergencies designed to elicit the kind of emotional support I'd once provided without question. When she claimed her mother had been hospitalized with chest pains, I sent a tasteful flower arrangement to the hospital address she'd provided instead of calling personally, a response that was supportive but maintained the emotional distance I'd worked so hard to establish. The flowers were returned undeliverable, confirming what I'd already suspected about the authenticity of her emergency, and I realized that the woman who'd once valued my friendship too much to risk changing it was now willing to manufacture crises just to get my attention. Our mutual friends started reporting increasingly uncomfortable interactions where Brooke couldn't participate in normal conversations without somehow bringing up my name and analyzing my social media activity with the intensity of a security analyst studying threat patterns. Jordan eventually stopped passing along her messages entirely, explaining that she'd become obsessive about my success and happiness to a degree that was making everyone uncomfortable, constantly asking whether I seemed truly content in Nashville or just putting on a show for social media. The woman who'd rejected my feelings to preserve our friendship had apparently spent the past 2 years watching me build exactly the kind of life she'd never imagined I was capable of creating, and her growing desperation suggested she was finally understanding what she'd actually lost when she'd chosen safety over possibility. What struck me most during our Nashville lunch was how small she seemed, not physically but in terms of her ambitions and worldview, still talking about the same types of client problems and creative challenges that had consumed our Thursday night conversations 2 years earlier while I described traveling across the Southeast for security assessments and presenting at international conferences where industry leaders sought my expertise on emerging cryptocurrency threats. The contrast was jarring, highlighting how much I'd grown professionally and personally while she appeared to be treading water in the same shallow pool of freelance struggles and interpersonal drama that had defined her existence when I knew her best, seemingly unchanged and unimproved. Exactly 3 years after leaving Seattle, my birthday arrived with perfect irony in the form of a long, manipulative text from Brooke reminiscing about our shared gaming memories and suggesting we reconnect now that enough time had passed for wounds to heal. The message appeared on my phone screen while Camilla and I were walking through Nashville's antique jewelry district, searching for vintage engagement ring settings that would complement the custom design we'd been planning for months. I read Brooke's carefully crafted words about missing our special bond and how she'd been thinking about reaching out for weeks, while simultaneously helping Camilla examine a 1920s Art Deco setting that perfectly matched her aesthetic sensibilities and engineering precision. The timing felt like the universe delivering a final test of how far I'd traveled from the person who'd once measured his worth by Brooke's approval and attention. We spent the afternoon visiting 3 different vintage jewelers, with Camilla offering insights about metalwork durability and stone setting techniques that demonstrated the same analytical approach she brought to prosthetic design, and I found myself posting an Instagram story of our hands over a display case with the caption, "Big decisions ahead," without thinking about who might see it. The response was immediate and predictable, with Brooke calling multiple times over the next hour before leaving a rambling voicemail about wanting to really reconnect as friends and how she'd been thinking about our special bond during this meaningful time in my life. Her message revealed that she'd been monitoring my social media more closely than I'd realized, interpreting my engagement announcement hints as some kind of invitation for her to re-enter my life at this pivotal moment. 6 weeks later, I proposed to Camilla during a private concert at the historic Ryman Auditorium, an intimate evening I'd arranged through connections I'd made in Nashville's music industry during my 3 years of genuine integration into the city's culture. The proposal itself felt like the natural culmination of building something authentic with someone who'd recognized my worth from the beginning, someone who approached our relationship with the same methodical care she brought to designing devices that would restore mobility to children who'd lost limbs. When she said yes through tears of genuine joy, holding up her hand to admire the ring we'd chosen together, I felt the satisfaction of someone who'd learned the difference between being appreciated and being settled for. Our engagement announcement, featuring a photo from the legendary venue where country music history was made, prompted an immediate flood of congratulations from colleagues, Nashville friends, and even some of our old Seattle crowd who'd stayed genuinely supportive over the years. But buried among the celebration was one final attempt at contact through Jordan, with Brooke expressing congratulations while hinting that now would be a natural time to rekindle our friendship since I was clearly happy and settled, as if my engagement was somehow permission for her to resume the relationship she'd terminated years earlier. I asked Jordan to stop facilitating any further communication and blocked Brooke completely across all platforms, finally severing the last thread connecting me to someone who'd spent 3 years watching me build a life she'd never believed I was capable of creating. The woman who'd once told me friendship was too precious to risk had apparently never understood that real friendship, like real love, requires seeing someone's potential rather than just accepting their current limitations, and I was grateful she'd been too afraid to take that risk because it led me to someone brave enough to build something extraordinary together. Standing in the Ryman that night with Camilla's hand in mine, surrounded by the ghosts of musicians who'd understood that sometimes you have to leave everything familiar behind to find your true voice, I realized that the greatest revenge isn't making someone regret losing you, it's becoming so genuinely happy that their opinion of your life becomes completely irrelevant to your sense of self-worth and future possibilities.